At my own granddaughter's birthday, my daughter-in-law told me, "This isn't your place. Go sit in the corner." She looked down on me for wearing a patched-up coat from 10 years ago. My son turned away, pretending I wasn't even there. I sat quietly. In that old jacket I stitched myself, watching them laugh like I had never been part of this family. That night, without warning, my billionaire brother flew in from California. He saw it all, and by the next morning, I had a beach house and 11 million in my name. That's when they flipped, treating me like royalty. But they had no idea what I was about to do next. They say family always has your back, but sometimes the ones closest to you are the first to push you aside. The day of Naina's birthday started cold, even though it was early spring. I wore my old wool coat, the same one I had worn when I took her to her first library visit, back when she still held my hand and whispered questions with big, curious eyes. The coat had a tear on the left side right under the pocket. I had stitched it up carefully the night before with the same thread I used to hem curtains 20 years ago. I arrived on time like always. Vanessa barely looked at me when I walked in. She just glanced at my coat, then turned to one of her friends and laughed into her champagne glass. Elliot didn't even greet me. He was busy adjusting the birthday sign over the fireplace. I smiled anyway and handed Naina a little hardcover book I had found at the second-hand store. She hugged me, sweet as ever, but her mother quickly pulled her away, whispering something under her breath. Then came the moment I will never forget. The dinner table was long, with a white cloth, crystal glasses, and flowers in full bloom at the center of the room. And right as I moved toward an open seat near the middle, Vanessa stopped me with a hand on my elbow. Her voice was light, but her words cut like ice. "This is not your seat," she said. "You'll be more comfortable over there near the window." She pointed toward a tiny round table at the edge of the room. It was set for one. I looked at her, then at Elliot. He saw me, then looked away. Not a word. So I walked over and sat down in silence. My knees ached in the draft near the sliding doors. From where I sat, I could see the chandelier lights hitting Vanessa's diamond earrings. I could hear Elliot laugh too loud at a story I had heard him tell 4 times before. I watched Naina blow out her candles, then look around for me. She couldn't see me through the crowd. I whispered happy birthday anyway. No one asked me if I wanted coffee. No one refilled my glass. For 2 hours I sat through speeches, toasts, music, and applause like a ghost sitting at the edge of a celebration that used to include me. When it was time for cake, Vanessa cut me a slice, walked over, and set it down with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. She didn't say anything about the coat, but the way she looked at the stitching said enough. I nodded and said, "Thank you." The thing is, I wasn't embarrassed. Not exactly. I wasn't angry. Not yet. What I felt sitting there in that coat I had, mended with my own hands, was something else, something heavier, like a stone in the center of my chest. It was the moment I knew they no longer saw me as part of the family. I had become an accessory background, a quiet burden to manage and seat politely away from the guests. I stayed until the end, helped clear the plastic cups, tucked a napkin into my purse like I always did. I smiled, I thanked, I kissed Naina goodbye. But the silence in my car on the way home was a different kind of silence than I had ever known. Later that night, I was sitting on the edge of my bed when my phone buzzed. Leonard. He never called. We messaged every few weeks, a birthday wish, a memory from childhood, nothing big. But this time, it was a video call. When I answered, I didn't say anything. He looked at me for 5 seconds, maybe less. "That coat," he said. "I know that coat." I nodded. I couldn't say a word. Not then. "I'm flying out," he said. "You don't have to," I whispered. "Too late," he said. "My jet's already on the runway." And he meant it. He arrived the next morning. No fanfare, no warnings. He walked right into Elliot's house as they were cleaning up decorations. I wasn't there, but Ruth told me how it happened. Leonard stood in the center of the living room and looked Elliot straight in the eyes, then turned to Vanessa. He said, You had her sit at the window in that coat after everything she's done for you." Vanessa laughed, tried to smooth it over. Elliot said it was a misunderstanding. Leonard Shaba didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice. He just walked out. And that same afternoon, he took me to lunch at a quiet bistro near the ocean. He handed me a folder with a simple title, Transfer Confirmation. Inside were two things, a deed to a beach house in Carmel and a new savings account in my name with 11 million in it. I stared at the papers for a long time. Then I looked at Leonard. "Why now?" I said. "Because they showed me who they are," he said. "But I already knew who you were." That evening, I returned to Elliot's house. Not as a guest, not as a mother looking for warmth. I came back with something they didn't expect: power. And believe me when I say what happened after that, they will never forget it. If you've ever been pushed to the side by the people you love, stay with me. What I did next changed everything, not just for them, but for me. The morning after the party, I stood in Leonard's hotel suite with my hands wrapped around a mug of black coffee I hadn't touched. He had already changed out of his travel clothes, crisp shirt tucked in, sleeves rolled, always neat, always clear-headed. The folder sat between us on the breakfast table. It wasn't thick, just enough to shift the ground beneath my feet. I didn't ask what was inside. I already knew. Leonard had never been the kind of man who made big gestures. He was quiet like me, not one for drama or long explanations. But when he moved, it meant something. And when he handed me that folder, he didn't make a speech. He just placed it down, gently, looked at me once and said, "You earned this a long time ago." I just didn't say it out loud. I opened it. The deed to the house was the first thing I saw. A beach cottage in Carmel by the sea, tucked behind a row of cypress trees with ocean air and a wraparound porch. I had seen photos of it once in a magazine. I remembered it because it had yellow shutters just like the house our grandmother lived in when we were children. Under that was the document for the account, my name, my information, $11 million transferred in, already confirmed. I kept my eyes on the papers, but I could feel Leonard watching me. I didn't cry. I didn't gasp. I took a breath and folded the folder shut. "They will never understand," I said. He nodded. "They don't need to. You do." We sat in silence for a while. No one needed to fill it. Later that day, I returned home. Not to Elliot's house, but to my apartment. 1 bedroom, 2nd floor. Nothing fancy. The carpet had started to thin in the hallway, and the kitchen sink dripped when the faucet wasn't turned just right. But it was mine, paid off in small installments over 20 years. I had no reason to leave it except for the fact that I knew now, finally, I didn't have to stay in it either. That night, I called Ruth. She had been my friend since high school, one of the few people who knew the full story, not just the version I let the world see. When I told her what Leonard had done, she didn't sound shocked, just quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Maybe now you'll believe what I've always believed, that you deserved more than the way they treated you." I said, "It's not about the money." She said, "Of course it isn't. But now they know you're not someone they can sideline." That stuck with me. I didn't go to sleep that night. I stayed up in the armchair near the window, folder in my lap, reading each line like it was a language I had never spoken before. It felt strange holding power, not because I didn't want it, but because I had lived so long without it. In the morning, I got dressed carefully, same clothes I always wore. The coat, too, not out of defiance. I just didn't want to step into this new phase of my life pretending to be someone I wasn't. Leonard picked me up at 10:01. He had made a reservation at a small restaurant by the marina. It was quiet, tucked away behind an old bait shop, the kind of place you'd miss if you didn't know where to look. Frank Doyle was already there waiting. I had never met him before, but Leonard had known him for years. He was sharp, soft-spoken, and precise in the way he explained things. He slid me a new folder. This one had tabs. He walked me through the structure of the trust Leonard had set up, the house, the account, the protections in place. Everything under my full control, no outside access, no way for anyone else to touch it. Then he brought out a second packet. This one had Vanessa's name on it. Leonard had asked Frank to check for anything suspicious. Not out of paranoia, just out of habit. What Frank found was small, almost careless. A wire transfer 6 months earlier, authorized using my name and address. The amount wasn't large, a little under $5,000, but the signature didn't match mine, not even close. Frank looked me in the eye when he said it. This was probably the test run. I didn't speak for a long time. Leonard said, "We can act on it or not. That's your choice." I said, "Not yet. Let them keep thinking they're in control." He nodded once, respectful. We left the restaurant without dessert. Leonard drove me back to my apartment, and as I stepped out of the car, he said, "If you ever need to disappear, the house in Carmel is ready." I smiled. "I'm not disappearing. I'm watching." That evening, Elliot called. First time in weeks he'd called just to check in. His voice was overly polite, full of surface-level questions. How had I been? Was I feeling well? Did I enjoy the party? I answered with short sentences. I didn't ask anything in return. Then he asked if we could all get together for dinner soon. Just the family, something casual. I said yes. He sounded surprised. I told him I would be happy to see them. I didn't say anything about Leonard, the house, or the account. I hung up the phone and looked at the folder again. I knew what I had. I knew what they didn't. And the thing about silence is, it gives you room to prepare. The invitation came 2 days later. A text from Vanessa, bright and overly sweet, asking if I wanted to come by for Sunday dinner. She said it would just be the family, nothing fancy, just a little get-together to make up for how rushed things felt at the birthday party. I didn't respond right away. I waited until evening, then replied with a simple yes. I already knew what they were doing, or at least what they were trying to do. Leonard's face had said it all when Frank laid out the wire transfer documents. That $5,000 test run wasn't random. It was Vanessa dipping her toe in the water to see if I'd notice. And when I didn't scream or accuse, they must have assumed I was either blind or weak. Maybe both. But I wasn't going to confront them yet. I wanted to know how far they were willing to go. When Sunday came, I arrived 10 minutes early. Vanessa opened the door herself, dressed in a pale pink blouse and pearls like she was hosting a garden club luncheon. She hugged me too tightly, then held me at arm's length and said I looked wonderful. Her eyes, however, dropped quickly to my coat. This time I didn't wear the mended one. I wore the coat Leonard had sent me last Christmas. Thick wool, dark gray, tailored and heavy on the shoulders. I didn't say where it came from, but Vanessa noticed. I saw the flicker in her expression. Dinner was already set on the table. White plates, gold-rimmed glasses, cloth napkins folded just so. Elliot was finishing a salad at the counter. He turned, smiled too wide, and came over to kiss my cheek. Na waved at me from the end of the table. I noticed she had pulled an extra chair beside her. I sat there, and for the first half hour, everything was polite. Tense, but polite. Vanessa asked if I wanted sparkling water or wine. Elliot told me about a new project he was managing. Na asked if I remembered the storybook I used to read her before bed. It felt rehearsed, like they had practiced lightness in front of a mirror. Then, as dessert was served, Vanessa stood and said she had something she wanted to show me. She walked out of the room and returned with a thin folder. Nothing official looking, just loose sheets of paper held together with a gold clip. She handed it to me with a smile and said, "It's just an idea, really. Something we've been thinking about." The first page was a printout of a franchise brochure, a cafe, something modern and sterile, all neutral colors and buzzwords. I flipped the pages slowly, not speaking. The next sheet was a mock business plan. Vanessa's handwriting filled the margins. Underlined phrases like low overhead and passive income stood out. Then came the part they really wanted me to see, a budget projection, estimated startup costs. Then a final page titled Partnership Options. My name was written in pen at the top. I looked at her. She launched into a little speech about how hard things had been after the pandemic, how Elliot's consulting firm had lost momentum, how she had dreams of starting something with a future, something for Nana, and how she knew I believed in family, more than anyone. That was always my thing, she said. Family first. Elliot kept his eyes down. I closed the folder. I asked if they had spoken to Leonard about any of this. That changed the air in the room. Vanessa hesitated, then laughed. She said this wasn't about him. She wanted something just between the three of us. A legacy project, she called it. A way to bring generations together. She even used the word bonding. I nodded and placed the folder beside my plate. I didn't say yes. I didn't say no. I didn't say much at all, just thanked her for the cake and left 15 minutes later saying I was tired. They didn't push. I think they assumed I would take the folder home, think it over, maybe feel guilty, feel flattered. They knew how to play that game. They thought I was still playing it too. But what they didn't know was that I left the folder behind on purpose. I didn't want to carry their manipulation home with me. That night, I called Leonard. "They're circling," I said. He replied, "Let them." Then I called Frank and told him it was time to dig deeper. I wanted to know if there were any other accounts, any small transactions linked to my name. He agreed, said he'd have something for me within 72 hours. 2 days later, Nana showed up at my apartment. She had never visited on her own before. She stood in the hallway in her school uniform, holding a tote bag and looking nervous. I let her in and made tea even though she didn't drink any. She said she had overheard her parents arguing. She didn't tell me everything, just that her dad was worried I wouldn't go for the business idea, and her mom kept saying not to worry, that I always gave in eventually. Then Na reached into her bag and pulled out a notebook. It was hers, spiral-bound, full of sketches and short poems. She flipped to the middle and showed me a page. She had drawn me, not the me from the party or from that night at dinner. It was me sitting in a chair by the ocean, wrapped in a shawl, looking out at the waves. I said nothing, just ran my fingers over the pencil lines. Then she said something that stopped me cold. "They don't see you, but I do." After she left, I sat alone with that sketch for a long time. I didn't cry, not then. But I knew what I had to do. The next invitation would come soon, another dinner, another try. But the next time I would come prepared, not with silence, not with patience, but with power, sharpened and ready. Because now it wasn't just about me. It was about what they were willing to do to get what they wanted and how far I was willing to go to make sure they never got it. Frank called me on a Thursday morning. His voice was steady, but there was a current underneath it, like someone trying to stay calm while holding something heavy. He said he had gone through everything: bank statements, credit inquiries, transaction records linked to my name, my old addresses, even my outdated phone number I hadn't used in years. What he found didn't surprise me, but it did sharpen my resolve. Over the past 8 months, there had been 3 more unauthorized credit checks done in my name. 2 were soft pulls, likely to test eligibility. 1 was a hard inquiry tied to a pre-approval process for a small business loan. The address listed was my son's home. The email attached was a slight variation of mine with 1 letter switched. Easy to overlook unless you were looking for it. Frank told me the documents were too clean to be accidental. They were laying groundwork, building a paper trail to support a future claim. Someone was planning to apply for a loan, using me as a silent partner. Probably just long enough to get the funds, then claim I had agreed, that I had forgotten, that I had been confused. Maybe they would have me sign something under the guise of a birthday card or a thank you note. I had seen tricks like that before, not in my own family, but now I was no longer surprised. I asked Frank if we could lock everything down tighter. He said yes. He started the process to freeze all credit activity under my social security number, set up verbal passwords with each bank, added two-step verification to my trust access, and flagged any activity related to my name that didn't pass through him directly. I asked him if that would be enough. He said it would be for now, but if they escalated, we would be ready. That afternoon, I met Leonard for coffee. I told him what Frank had found. He didn't react with anger. He didn't curse or pace. He just nodded once and said, "They're not clever, just persistent." Then he pulled out a small folder from his briefcase. Inside was a printed seating chart for a private dining room at a high-end restaurant. Vanessa's name was scribbled in the corner. Leonard said, "This is for Saturday. I overheard Elliot talking to a mutual contact at a golf club. They're hosting a dinner, not for us, for potential investors. The cafe pitch is going wide." So that was it. I had said nothing, had not refused, had not accepted, had simply left the folder on their table. And in that silence, they decided to move forward as if I had already said yes. They were presenting me as a financial backer to people I didn't even know. That night, I sat at my kitchen table for hours. I opened the drawer where I kept my old recipe cards, the ones with oil stains and fading ink. I wasn't hungry. I just needed something to touch that didn't lie to me, something honest. By midnight, I had made up my mind. I called Ruth the next morning. I asked her if she remembered that conversation we had years ago, the one where she said, "One day I would stop forgiving people who knew exactly what they were doing." She laughed. Then she asked what I had in mind. I told her everything. Then I asked if she still had that old DSLR camera her nephew gave her. I met Frank later that afternoon. We went over my plan. He was cautious at first. Then he said it might work if we did it carefully. He agreed to be nearby during the dinner. He wouldn't be inside, but he would be close enough to intervene if necessary. He also asked if I wanted to bring Leonard. I said no. Leonard had already done his part. This next move had to be mine. Saturday came quickly. I dressed simply, dark pants, a soft blouse, and a new coat, not too expensive, but elegant, the kind that didn't scream anything but whispered that I was no longer the woman in the corner chair. I arrived 10 minutes early. Ruth was all ready. There, sitting at a nearby table with her camera resting casually beside her wine glass. I walked into the private dining room. The hostess hesitated when she saw my name wasn't on the list. I gave her Vanessa's full name and said I was her mother-in-law, and expected. She blinked, then nodded and led me in. The room was bright, with glass walls, white linen, and soft piano music playing in the background. Vanessa was standing near the head of the table, speaking to a group of well-dressed men and women. Elliot sat nearby, flipping through a printed presentation. My photo was on one of the slides, a candid image from Na's birthday party. Underneath it, the words, "Founding Family Partner." Vanessa saw me. Her smile froze. I walked slowly toward the table, pulled out a chair, and sat down. The room went quiet. I looked at the presentation in front of me. Pages filled with charts. Startup estimates, revenue projections. My name appeared 5 times. Once on a mock check, twice in testimonial quotes I had never said, once under a signature line, and once in the legal section as a silent guarantor. Vanessa opened her mouth to speak. I raised a hand gently. I said, "I'd like to clarify something before we eat." Then I turned to the guests. I said, "My name is Helen Whitford. I am not part of this business. I have not invested. I have not agreed to be listed on any documents. I was not aware of this dinner until yesterday, and what's been presented here is false. I have legal documentation ready to show that my financial identity has been manipulated without my consent." Then I reached into my purse and pulled out a small envelope. I said, "These are copies of credit inquiries and a pre-approval request. done using my information linked to this project. They were submitted without my knowledge, and I have retained legal counsel to pursue a full investigation. Elliot stood up, his face pale. Vanessa started to say something, but the guests were already shifting, whispering. One of the men closed his folder. Another pushed his chair back. I stood. I said, "I have no further comment at this time. Thank you." Then I walked out. Ruth caught everything. Photos, faces, reactions, all of it. She followed me out to the street, slipped the memory card into a padded sleeve, and handed it to Frank, who was waiting in his car a block away. By evening, Frank had filed a formal fraud alert with the authorities. Not a lawsuit yet, just a paper trail. The first official step. Elliot and Vanessa wouldn't know that until next week, but I already knew this wasn't the end. It was only the opening move. By Sunday morning, word had already started to spread. It began with a call from Leonard. He had heard about the dinner, not from me, but through a colleague whose law firm had been invited as potential investors. The man had left early, disturbed by what he called a family squabble that turned into a legal warning. Leonard didn't ask for details. He just said one sentence. "I hope you feel the ground shifting." And I did, but it wasn't loud. It wasn't a moment of victory, not the kind that makes you want to laugh or cheer. It was quieter than that, like the weight of years lifting inch by inch off my shoulders. Not all at once, just enough to breathe differently. I made coffee. I sat in my kitchen. I didn't touch the newspaper. I didn't check my phone. Later that day, Frank called. He had filed the fraud alert as promised. He also told me the preliminary report from the credit monitoring agency had confirmed everything we suspected. The activity in my name linked directly, back to Elliot's home IP address. The signature on the loan pre-approval didn't match mine. The trail was clean, not speculative, not circumstantial, just enough for legal action if I chose to move forward. I told him to wait. I wasn't ready for the courtroom. Not yet. What I wanted was time, not to stall, but to observe. People show their truest selves when they believe the danger has passed. I didn't have to wait long. Tuesday afternoon, Vanessa showed up at my apartment without warning. She rang the bell 3 times. I opened the door just enough to see her face. She looked polished as always, hair smooth, lips lined, but her eyes were tired, dark circles under foundation. She smiled tightly and asked if we could talk. I didn't invite her in. We sat on the bench outside my building. The sky was flat, the air damp with the kind of chill that gets into your bones even when you wear the right coat. She started with small talk, asked how I was feeling, said she had been meaning to stop by for weeks. I didn't answer. I waited. Then she said it. She told me there had been a misunderstanding, that the dinner was never meant to misrepresent me, that Elliot had exaggerated in the presentation, and things had spiraled. She said they had planned to follow up with me later, clarify the terms, and offer me a more formal role. She said it all without pausing, voice smooth like it had been practiced. When she was finished, I looked straight ahead and said nothing. After a few seconds, she shifted in her seat and added that the investors had backed out, that Elliot's name had been removed from 2 local business groups, that someone had posted a blurry photo from the dinner online, and a rumor was starting to spread. Still, I didn't speak. Then she turned to me. Her voice dropped. She said, "You're punishing us." It wasn't a question, just a statement, flat and sharp. I turned to her then. I said, "I'm protecting what I built." She didn't respond. I stood and opened the front door. She didn't follow me. That evening, Na called. Her voice was quiet, like she was speaking from under a blanket. She asked if I was okay. I told her I was. She said she saw her parents arguing again, this time about damage control, about what to say to the family, about whether to blame a misunderstanding or admit they went too far. She said she overheard Vanessa suggest telling people I had misunderstood. The dinner, that maybe I was confused, that I hadn't been in the best frame of mind lately. Nina paused, then said she knew it wasn't true, that I wasn't confused, that I had been clear, that I had done everything deliberately and with strength. Then she apologized. I told her she had nothing to be sorry for. The next morning, Ruth came over with a bag of groceries. She didn't say anything about the dinner, though I knew she had heard more than just the photos. She handed me a new memory card with copies of everything, images, timestamps, audio clips she had managed to catch on her phone. Not high quality, but enough. She said, "If you decide to press forward, don't hesitate. I've seen women like you stay quiet too long." I nodded, but I wasn't rushing. I was waiting, watching. That Friday, Elliot called. His voice was flat, not apologetic, just worn out. He said he wanted to talk, just the two of us. I agreed to meet. Him on Sunday, not at his house, not at mine, but at a public place, neutral ground, a park bench near the lake where he used to feed ducks as a boy. When I arrived, he was already sitting. He didn't look like himself. Suit too wrinkled, hair not brushed, the look of a man who had been trying to fix too many things with too few tools. He stood as I approached, then sat again without shaking my hand. He began with a story about a client who had dropped his name, from an ongoing contract, about a call from a colleague who said his reputation was taking hits on closed forums. Then he said the sentence that told me everything I needed to know. He said, "This could ruin me. Not us, not the family, just him." I listened. Then he said he wanted to make it right, that he would shut everything down, that he would release a statement saying I had no part in the business, that he would withdraw all documents, delete any digital traces, and issue a correction to the investors. He said it all like a checklist. I let him finish. Then I said, "You used my name without asking. You assumed I would never fight back." He looked at me, eyes pleading. I said, "I'm not here to bargain. I'm here to let you know I'm aware, and I will act if necessary." Then I stood. I didn't say goodbye. I didn't turn back. The leaves crunched under my feet as I walked away. I didn't feel triumphant, but I didn't feel afraid either. I felt like the part of me that had once believed I owed them something had finally gone quiet. And what was left was mine, fully, quietly, and completely under my control. The following. Monday arrived with stillness. No calls, no messages, no visits, just silence. A strange stretching kind of quiet that didn't feel peaceful, but expectant, like the space between thunder and the sound of something falling. I went about my day, as if nothing were brewing beneath it. Watered the plants, folded laundry, walked 2 blocks to pick up more thread for my mending basket. Even though I had no plans to sew, I needed to feel like I was moving towards something, even if I didn't yet know where it would land. Frank had called the night before after my meeting with Elliot. He said they had logged multiple back-end attempts to access financial tools linked to my Social Security number. Attempts, not breaches. Whoever had tried didn't get far. Password protections had held. Protocols were in place. Still, he advised documenting everything from that point on. Conversations, meetings, paper trails. I already had a folder set aside for that. I labeled it plainly with the word protection in ink that didn't fade when touched. That evening, as the sun slipped low behind the trees, I received an unexpected delivery. A manila envelope hand-delivered by a courier who didn't say a word. No return address, no signature. I opened it slowly at the kitchen table, unsealing the flap with the back of a butter knife. Inside was a printed document, a draft business proposal, not the one Vanessa had shown me at the dinner. This one was updated, reformatted, bearing my full legal name as a co-executive and guarantor. My address was listed in the company registry section. There were notes in the margins, handwritten in Vanessa's script. Notes that said things like, tie in her family legacy, lean on maternal narrative, and mention lifelong loyalty to community. Attached to the back was a copy of a signature. Mine, or at least something trying to be mine. I stared at it for a long time, then took a photo with my phone and slid the whole thing into the folder marked protection. The next morning, I met Frank at his office. He laid everything out. He had already filed a formal claim with the State Financial Board, flagged the fraudulent document, and sent a copy to a contact within the fraud division. He didn't ask me if I wanted to escalate. He knew this wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about accountability. Frank said the evidence was substantial, more than enough for a cease and desist order, and possibly more if we pursued criminal charges. He paused before continuing, then asked if I wanted to go public. I told him not yet. Let the damage come quietly at first. Sometimes silence echoes louder than shouting. The order was served on Thursday. A uniformed officer arrived at Elliot's office just after noon, handed him the envelope in full view of his staff. Vanessa received hers that same afternoon at the front door of their home. Nana saw it happen. She told me later that her mother's hand shook as she took the envelope, that her father didn't speak for an hour afterward. By Friday, the consequences began to unfold. The cafe project collapsed, investors pulled out, emails leaked, a few copies of the business draft had already circulated beyond their circle. One ended up with a blogger who specialized in small business fraud. Another made its way to a local finance reporter. The story hadn't gone national, not yet, but it had spread far enough to stain. The article didn't mention my name. It referred only to an anonymous whistleblower with legal representation. But everyone in the room that night knew, and the people they had tried to impress knew, and that was enough. Leonard called me just before dinner. He didn't gloat. He just said that sometimes truth doesn't need an audience. It just needs a window. I didn't reply. I just let the words settle. That night, Vanessa called. Not Elliot, not Nana, Vanessa. Her voice was low, tired. She asked to meet. I didn't ask where or when. I told her to come by tomorrow, early before the world woke up. She arrived just after 7, dressed in jeans and a sweatshirt I didn't recognize. No makeup, no smile. She stood at my door with a paper bag of croissants from a shop too far to walk to that early. We sat at the table, the one with the faded corners and one uneven leg I kept meaning to fix. She set the bag down, but didn't open it. She didn't try to explain, didn't give me a speech. She just said she was sorry, that she had made a mistake, that she had gone too far, that she didn't expect me to forgive her. But she needed me to hear it out loud. I said nothing. She said Elliot hadn't spoken much since the envelope arrived, that his firm was reviewing his contracts, that one of his long-term clients had gone quiet. She said they were trying to hold things together for Nina, but that even she could see through it. She said she didn't know how to fix what had broken. Then she asked if I hated her. I looked at her for a long time. Then I told her I didn't, because hate takes energy. Hate is active, and I had stopped giving them that power. What I felt wasn't hatred. It was a clear, clean detachment, the kind that comes after years of noise, when you finally learn to sit in stillness without apologizing for it. She nodded. Her eyes didn't water, but her mouth trembled. She stood up to leave. She didn't ask for anything, just said thank you, picked up the bag of croissants, and walked out the door. That afternoon, I updated the contents of my trust. With Frank's help, I amended the distribution clause. Elliot and Vanessa were removed entirely. The assets would transfer in time to a charitable foundation supporting women over 60 navigating financial abuse. A secondary provision allowed for educational support should Nana choose to pursue a path different from her parents. That part I kept quiet. I didn't need to announce it. I just needed to know that if this cycle ever tried to repeat itself, it would end before it reached her. That was the only thing left that mattered. The following week unfolded like a quiet unraveling. No explosions, no slammed doors, just slow, deliberate collapse. What started as whispers had now become loud enough that no one could pretend not to hear. At first, I noticed it in subtle ways. Vanessa's name was no longer on the sponsorship list for the charity gala she had once co-chaired. The board of trustees at the private academy Nena attended had quietly removed her from the advisory circle, and Elliot, once a regular feature on local business podcasts, was conspicuously absent from the latest episodes. Leonard updated me regularly, not in the spirit of gossip, but in clarity. He said that one of Elliot's financial clients had begun formal proceedings for breach of trust, claiming the firm had failed to disclose potential conflicts of interest. Another client had reportedly backed out of a partnership deal after seeing the redacted version of the leaked proposal. I never asked Leonard to tell me these things, but he did. Always matter of fact, never smug. His updates were simply part of the path forward. Each detail a paving stone in a road I had long been forced off of, now finally reclaiming. On Thursday morning, a letter arrived. Not an email, a real letter, handwritten. The envelope was thick and ivory-colored with my name written in Vanessa's. Unmistakable cursive. Inside was one sheet folded twice. No greeting, no date, just a few lines. It said she hoped I would consider restoring some part of what was lost, that she had spoken with Elliot, that they were both in agreement about wanting to move forward. She said they were not asking for the money back, only a conversation, one where we could meet in the middle. There was no apology in the letter, no mention of the forged document, no acknowledgement of the harm they had tried to orchestrate behind closed doors. I placed the letter in the folder marked Protection and didn't respond. That weekend, Nena showed up again. She knocked on the back door, wearing a windbreaker and jeans too short at the ankles. Her cheeks were flushed, her eyes wide and uncertain. I opened the door without speaking, stepped aside, and let her in. She took off her shoes by instinct, then hesitated before sitting at the kitchen table. Her hands were balled in fists on her lap, like she was holding something heavy and invisible. She didn't mention her parents. She asked if we could take a walk. We walked in silence for nearly 3 blocks before she spoke. She said she had overheard her father on the phone, with someone from his firm, using phrases she didn't understand fully, but knew sounded like trouble. She said her mother had been crying in the pantry at night, thinking no one could hear. Then she said something that caught my breath. She said she had found the proposal, the one with my forged signature. She had seen it in a drawer in her father's study, half buried under other paperwork. She hadn't meant to go through anything. She had just been looking for a spare charger. When she saw my name, she froze. She told me she recognized the handwriting right away. Then she asked if that was what had started all this. I didn't answer. She looked up at me with eyes I used to see in the mirror when I was her age, eyes that had not yet learned to lie to themselves, eyes that still wanted the truth, even if it hurt. I told her it wasn't her fault, that sometimes adults break things they cannot fix, and the ones who suffer most are those who didn't ask to be part of the damage. She said she didn't know whose side to be on anymore. I told her there were no sides. Only lines we draw when people cross too far, and sometimes those lines are not to keep others out, but to keep ourselves safe inside. She nodded, then reached into her pocket and pulled out a folded piece of notebook paper. She handed it to me and said, "This is for you. I wrote it yesterday." I unfolded the paper after she left. It was a poem, one she had written, simple but raw, about storms and lighthouses and the ache of standing in a place that no longer felt like home. I kept it tucked in the side of my protection folder, not for evidence, but for remembrance. That night, Leonard called with an update. The firm representing the charity Vanessa had once worked with had officially ended all associations with her. The board had voted to remove her name from all marketing materials, and a public statement had been drafted. Elliot's situation had worsened. His firm had placed him on an indefinite leave. Word had spread about the investigation. A few media outlets had requested comments. Most were turned away, but the damage was done. Silence, once their weapon, had become their undoing. Later that evening, I received another letter. This one from a name I didn't recognize at first. A journalist, someone who had been following the paper trail of the cafe deal. They wanted a comment, a quote. I declined. I had no interest in turning this into a story for others to dissect. The next morning, I called Frank. I told him I wanted to host a small gathering. Nothing big, just a few key people. My brother Leonard, a couple of women from the community center, people who had stood with me without needing to raise their voices. He asked if I wanted it catered. I said, no, I would cook real food my way. That afternoon, I made a list. Not of who to invite, but of what to let go. Rage, resentment, regret. Not because they weren't earned, but because they took up space where healing could live. And that evening, I stood in my kitchen, apron tied tight, hands busy, breath even. Outside, the wind picked up. Inside, I felt nothing but stillness, the kind that follows the fire, the kind that says, it is done. I spent the entire morning prepping in silence. The windows were open, letting in the salt wind from the coast. A pot of butternut squash soup simmered on the stove, while a tray of rosemary potatoes roasted in the oven. The smell was comforting, grounding. I wasn't cooking for guests. I was cooking for myself, for the woman who had been humiliated in her own family and then stood back up, slow but certain. Leonard arrived first. He brought wine, even, though he knew I rarely drank. He placed it on the counter without a word and just nodded, his eyes kind. After him came Diane from the library board, her arms full of pies from her garden. Then Frank, of course, who showed up with fresh sourdough and a wink. Every person who entered that house had at some point seen me when I was invisible to others, and they came without expectations, just presence. I had set the table with no fuss, no centerpieces, no folded napkins, just clean plates, cloth napkins, and silverware polished by hand. A meal was not about performance, it was about energy. And that night, I needed clarity more than presentation. Then, just as the last dish was being placed, the doorbell rang again. Not loudly, not hurried, just once. I wiped my hands, walked to the door, and opened it. Vanessa stood there, alone. She wore a navy trench coat and low heels. Her hair was pulled back tighter than usual, and her lips were pressed into a line that looked practiced, not natural. She held nothing in her hands. I didn't step aside. She cleared her throat and said she had heard about the dinner, that Nina had mentioned it, that she thought maybe this was the right moment to talk, that she wasn't here to argue, only to be heard. I nodded just once, then stepped aside. Vanessa walked in slowly, almost hesitantly. The conversation at the table dulled when they saw her. Frank stood. Diane raised an eyebrow. Leonard's face didn't change at all. I motioned for Vanessa to sit in the empty chair across from me. It had not been placed for her, but somehow it waited. We all ate first. The food softened the edges. Warmth filled the room. There was laughter, quiet moments of eye contact, and stories from long ago that didn't require pain to be meaningful. Vanessa sat mostly in silence, sipping water, pushing food around her plate. When the last dish was cleared and the tea was poured, the room shifted. Leonard leaned back. Diane excused herself early. Frank stayed, but moved to the couch. That left me and Vanessa facing each other at a now empty table, the silence as heavy as it was earned. She looked at me, eyes wide but not apologetic. Then she started to speak. She said that after Nina told her what had happened, she didn't believe it at first. She thought it was exaggeration or maybe some misunderstanding, but then she found the proposal again. She compared the signature. She remembered the timing, and she realized it hadn't been a mistake. It had been deliberate. She admitted she had helped Elliot forge my name, that it had been his idea first, but she had gone along with it. That she was angry back then, that she thought I was interfering, that she believed foolishly that if they took everything, I would finally leave them alone. I listened, not because I wanted to, but because she was finally saying what I already knew. She said it didn't feel like stealing back then. It felt like reclaiming what she thought was rightfully theirs. Then she paused, and for the first time her voice cracked. She said Elliot had left, just packed a bag, and disappeared after being suspended. He hadn't said goodbye to Nina, hadn't left a note, just gone. His firm was under investigation. Their accounts were frozen. Creditors were calling. The house had been appraised for quick sale. She said she had nowhere else to go. And then she asked if I would let her stay, just for a while. Not forever, just until things settled, just until she figured out her next step. My fingers curled slightly around the edge of my cup. I looked at her, not with anger, not even with sadness, just stillness. And I told her something I hadn't said in years, that forgiveness was not a debt I owed, that reconciliation was not shelter, that consequences were not cruelty, they were clarity. I told her she could not stay, not because I hated her, but because I had finally built a space where I could breathe again, and she had once tried to bury that breath under greed and silence. She didn't cry, but her eyes glistened, and for a moment, I saw the woman she might have been, had she chosen differently, had she chosen kindness instead of control. She stood, nodded once, and walked out. I didn't follow. Frank stepped into the room a moment later. He didn't ask anything, just started gathering cups. Leonard met my eyes and said one sentence, "It's done." And it was. Later that night, I sat on the porch with a blanket around my shoulders. The ocean sounded like breathing, deep, rhythmic, patient. The lights inside the house glowed warm behind me. And for the first time in years, I felt no need to look over my shoulder because the people who tried to erase me were no longer in control of the story. I was, and I was just getting started. The day the board convened was not marked on any official calendar. It was whispered between lawyers and hinted at in memos buried under unrelated subject lines. But I had known it was coming, not because anyone told me, but because I had learned long ago how to read silence louder than words. Elliot had once tried to paint me as the old woman who baked muffins for staff meetings and misplaced her own house keys. He thought if he made me small in reputation, he could keep me small in legal standing. What he never counted on was how deep I had kept my receipts and how wide my reach had become. At 9:47 a.m., I walked into the glass tower I had helped fund 15 years ago. The receptionist, a new girl with shaky hands and polite eyes, didn't recognize me, but the partner in the navy suit who passed by did. His steps faltered, his mouth opened, then closed. I simply nodded and moved past him. The boardroom had 12 chairs. I had sat in each one at least once during the years when they thought I was harmless enough to be included, but forgettable enough to be ignored. Today, I sat at the head. Leonard joined me 5 minutes later. No introductions, no explanations, just the quiet click of his briefcase latching open and the rustle of paper. By 10 guys, the room filled. 12 seats, 11 men, 1 woman, me. The CFO, a man named Curtis, started with projections. He had rehearsed his words, carefully curated optimism to cushion the real news, but his voice cracked midway through his third sentence. I watched them squirm. The audit had not gone well. The numbers Elliot had manipulated were showing up now, like bruises that couldn't be covered with foundation. Months of cooked books, funneled accounts, and a ghost LLC tied to a trust that bore my forged signature. The firm was bleeding, and not quietly. I waited until Curtis finished. Then I leaned forward and slid a folder across the table. Inside were signed affidavits, transaction records, emails, and surveillance stills. None of it dramatic, all of it devastating. The silence that followed was not respectful. It was terrified. I didn't yell. I didn't demand. I simply spoke slowly and without apology. I explained how the forged documents had not only invalidated previous deals, but opened the firm to federal investigation. I outlined how the use of my name and assets without consent positioned the firm at risk of class action suits from former clients. Then I ended with the clause I had reinstated last month, quietly and without fanfare, that allowed me to call an emergency vote to restructure leadership in times of ethical crisis. Leonard handed out printed ballots. When the vote concluded, Elliot's name was stripped from all legal ties to the firm. He was to be investigated internally and externally. His shares were frozen, his privileges revoked, and his exit was to be made public before the day was out. There were no objections. At noon, I stepped into the hallway, shoulders square. No one followed me. Outside, the air was bright. The sunlight didn't feel warm. It felt like steel. Frank waited by the curb, with the car running. When I slid into the passenger seat, he didn't ask what happened. He just said one thing: "You gave them the storm they tried to bury you under." And we drove off. Later that evening, I sat by the window in my study, overlooking the coastline. The tide was high. The wind carried a new kind of quiet. Not the silence of exclusion, the silence of aftermath. I picked up the letter opener from my desk, not to open anything, just to hold it. In that moment, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt precise. I had not destroyed Elliot. He had done that himself. All I had done was remove the curtain. I remembered the birthday party, the coat I had stitched a decade ago, the way Vanessa's voice had cut into me like paper. Then I remembered Na's small hand that had once tugged on mine in a grocery store, asking if I could make my sweet potato casserole for her birthday. And I remembered how Vanessa had slapped that memory away years later with a sigh and a schedule. This was not revenge. It was restoration. The firm would survive, but not untouched. Elliot would face consequences, but not vengeance. I would move forward, but not unchanged. Justice was not fire. It was frost. It was the quiet room you walked into, thinking you were alone, only to realize the lights had been on the whole time, and someone had been watching. As I closed my eyes that night, I knew the storm wasn't over. But for the first time in years, it wasn't swallowing me whole. It was clearing, and I was standing in the center, finally dry. They didn't call it a family meeting. They called it brunch. But the undertone was clear from the second I walked in. Vanessa was already seated at the head of the long walnut table, pretending to scroll through her phone, one perfectly manicured nail tapping against the glass in a rhythm too exact to be accidental. Brendan stood by the buffet counter pouring orange juice into a crystal pitcher he never used unless guests were coming. I recognized that signal. Today, I was the guest. The room was too quiet. Even Nana, usually humming or bouncing a little, when she walked, moved slowly, her eyes darting from face to face like she didn't know where to land. I sat at the far end, not because they told me to, but because I had long learned not to sit where I wasn't wanted. The conversation began innocuously enough. Talk of real estate prices, Nana's school, Brendan's latest promotion. They kept their smiles polished and their sentences neat, but every line carried a weight that hovered just above the table. I knew what they were waiting for, the announcement. Vanessa reached for her coffee, took a sip, then casually asked if I had talked to Elliot lately. I said no. I didn't add that Elliot was under federal investigation and had tried to call me 4 times since the board meeting. That part wasn't for them. Brendan cleared his throat. Vanessa placed her cup down with a deliberate clink. Then it began. They wanted clarity, they said. They wanted transparency. They said they knew I had spoken to lawyers. They had heard rumors. The firm was talking. The community was buzzing. Someone from the foundation board had hinted that my name was back on the original trust. Vanessa's tone stayed calm, but her hands were clenched beneath the table. I could see the tension in her knuckles. They wanted to know what I was planning to do next. I listened. I didn't speak for a while. Then I said plainly that the trust was mine again, that the previous revocation had been deemed invalid, that all assets tied to that account were now under my authority, and any funds withdrawn during the period of forgery were now under audit. They blinked. Vanessa's face froze in a way only practiced composure could. Brendan looked down, and then the words started to unravel. Not from me, from them. Vanessa said she had been doing her best, that she had only ever wanted to protect. Brendan, that family finances were messy, and lines got blurred, and intentions were misunderstood. Brendan mumbled something about stress, about trying to be a good father, about pressure. He said he had only signed what Vanessa gave him, had never read most of the paperwork, and had trusted that everything was legal. I said nothing. They thought silence was an invitation. It wasn't. Vanessa finally leaned forward, voice low, her eyes steady. She said she wanted to fix this. She said we could come to an agreement privately, that there was no need for lawyers, that public scandal would hurt Nana, that we were family and this could be salvaged. That word again, family. I waited a beat, then I asked her what she thought family meant. Vanessa hesitated. I continued. Was it family when she had whispered to Brendan that I was becoming a burden? Was it family when she told Nana that Grandma was too old to be involved in big decisions? Was it family when she sat silent as I was pushed out of the trust? When I was told not to wear certain clothes around their friends? When I was told not to bring casseroles to birthday parties because the caterer had it covered? I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. By the time I finished, Vanessa's posture had shifted, not slouched, but smaller. Brendan tried to speak. I raised one hand and he stopped. I said that forgiveness didn't mean forgetfulness and that trust was not a debt to be repaid. It was a gift. Once broken, it didn't grow back the same. I stood then, slowly, deliberately. I told them that the house they lived in would be undergoing transfer review, that all future allowances from the foundation would be paused pending investigation, and that legal teams would contact them for full financial disclosures. Their faces paled. I paused at the doorway. Then I turned and looked at Nina. She hadn't said a word the whole time. She just stared at me, her eyes wide, not angry, just confused, hurt, watching something she didn't yet have the language to explain. I softened my tone. I told her I would always love her, that none of what was happening was her fault, that sometimes adults make mistakes so big it takes more than love to fix them. Then I left. Back home, I didn't cry. I made tea. I folded a towel. I checked the windows. Later, as dusk set in, I stood by the sliding doors and watched the ocean swell. I thought about the past year, about how pain didn't always look like screaming matches and broken glass. Sometimes it looked like brunch. Sometimes it sounded like silence over a meal. Sometimes it felt like pretending you were invited when you had never been welcome. But that chapter had closed. The next would not begin with begging or apologies. It would begin with boundaries, real ones, legal ones. And for the first time in a long time, I felt the calm that comes not from hope, but from certainty. The kind that settles in your bones and tells you you did not start the fire, but you sure as hell are going to watch it go out on your own terms. By the next morning, something in me had shifted for good. I wasn't angry anymore, not in the way I had been before. Not the kind of anger that burned hot and loud, clawing at the walls of my chest, begging to be heard. No, this was a colder, quieter anger. The kind that sits with its back straight, that looks you in the eye and waits for your next move. I didn't rush into any more meetings. I didn't answer Brendan's texts. I didn't return the call from Vanessa's lawyer, who left a voicemail filled with words like amicable and cooperation. Instead, I took the train down the coast, not to hide, but to remember. I went to a town Brendan had never visited, the one where I spent 2 summers taking care of my father when he got sick. Back then, I was a different version of myself, younger, unsure, always carrying guilt like a second skin. Now I carried something else. I walked past the old dock, past the tiny grocery store that still smelled like wet rope and lemons, past the inn where I once cried myself to sleep after learning Brendan had dropped out of college and lied about it for a full year. The innkeeper remembered me. She said I looked stronger. I didn't correct her. That afternoon, I checked into the same room, still creaky, still small, but it had a quiet view of the sea, and I sat by the window for hours without needing to speak. I let the silence work its way into me, and for the first time since this whole unraveling began, I allowed myself to feel something I hadn't dared touch: grief. Not for Brendan, not for Vanessa, but for the version of myself that had waited. Too long, waited to be respected, waited to be included, waited for birthdays that never came, calls that never arrived, apologies that would never be spoken. That woman had tried her best, but she had lived bent over, shrinking herself to make others feel tall. She was gone now. I sat still for a long time, letting that sink in. The next morning, I left a note for the innkeeper thanking her. Then I drove inland, not back home, but to the offices of the Women's Fund I had been supporting for the past year. They didn't know I was coming, but when I walked in, the director looked up from her desk and stood. She said she had just been finalizing the paperwork for the grant I promised before everything with Brendan exploded. She looked nervous, as if I might pull out. I smiled and shook my head. I told her we weren't scaling back, we were expanding. The scholarship I had started in honor of my mother, who raised 4 children on a cashier's salary and never once asked for praise, would now include housing stipends, mentorship programs, and full tuition for select women over 40 returning to school. We signed the paperwork together. It felt like signing my own name for the first time. I spent the afternoon with the team talking, planning, laughing. These women didn't ask about Brendan or the lawsuit or my family. They saw me for what I brought to the table and not what I had lost. By the end of the day, I was tired, but a different kind of tired, not defeated, just full. I returned home that night and stood at my front door a moment longer than usual, not to brace myself, but to breathe. Everything in the house was still. I turned on one light in the living room and sat quietly, letting the silence greet me like an old friend. The next morning, a manila envelope arrived. Not from Brendan, but from Nana. Inside was a letter. Handwritten, shaky in parts, bold in others. She said she was sorry for not speaking up sooner, that she had heard more than she let on, that she had seen the way Vanessa looked at me when she thought I wasn't watching. She said she didn't know what to do, that she felt torn, that she didn't want to pick sides, but she wanted to be honest. She wanted to know me, the real me, and if I was willing, she would like to come over, not for anything big, just tea. I folded the letter carefully and placed it inside a drawer. Then I went to the kitchen and pulled out the teapot I hadn't used. In over a year, it still shone. Everything was changing now in small but certain ways. And I didn't need a grand gesture. I didn't need Brendan to fall at my feet or Vanessa to cry in regret. What I needed, what I had always needed, was to see myself again, not as the version others had constructed, but as the woman who had stood tall in a room full of people trying to erase her and refused to vanish. A week after Nana's letter arrived, I heard the sound of her footsteps on my front porch. She didn't ring the bell right away. I watched through the lace curtain as she stood there, hesitating, holding a little white paper bag. Her hand shook slightly, but she was here. I opened the door and smiled. She stepped in quietly, eyes scanning the hallway as if it were unfamiliar. I didn't ask why she hadn't come sooner. I didn't need to. She placed the bag on the table. Inside was a lemon scone, still warm. We sat across from each other in the sunroom, just the two of us. For once, no Brendan, no Vanessa, no strained small talk or sideways glances. Just 2 women generations apart, quietly figuring out what to do with the space between them. I poured us tea. She took hers with honey and a splash of milk, just like me. At first, we didn't talk about anything important. We talked about the weather, the garden, the fact that she had taken up embroidery again. Then, somewhere between the second cup and the end of the scone, she spoke. She said she had always admired the way I carried myself, even when Brendan rolled his eyes. She admitted there were times she wanted to say something to defend me, but she didn't know how. She had grown up thinking that silence kept the peace. I told her that silence can be a form of violence, too. She nodded, not defensive, just quietly absorbing. That afternoon, we didn't fix anything, but something shifted. The wall cracked just a little. A week later, she came again and again, each time a little longer, a little warmer. Meanwhile, Brendan stayed silent. I never answered his calls. I never read his apology email. I had moved past, needing him to understand. Some doors don't need to be reopened. Some bridges burn for good reason. Vanessa, I heard, had taken a temporary position out of state. Word was, she left before the civil investigation reached her desk. My lawyer had handled the paperwork with surgical precision. Her name no longer appeared on anything tied to me. And as for the foundation, it bloomed. The day we announced the expansion at the local college, I stood on stage before a room full of women, some younger than Nina, some older than me, all of them fierce in quiet ways, all of them looking for a second chance. I spoke softly, clearly. I told them I wasn't a hero, just someone who learned far too late that waiting for permission to matter is a waste of breath. After the ceremony, one of the women came up to me. Her hands were rough from years of factory work. She hugged me tight and whispered that because of me, she had enrolled in night school for the first time in her life. That hug meant more to me than Brendan's approval ever had. A month later, I sold the house Brendan once mocked. I moved into a small cottage by the sea. One level, big windows, a porch swing, quiet. I kept the old coat, the one they laughed at. It hangs in my hallway now, not as a reminder of shame, but as proof of how far I've come. I wore that coat through storms they couldn't imagine, and I stitched it with hands that never stopped giving, even when no one said, "Thank you." I am no longer the woman who waited. I am the woman who walks into a room and knows she belongs, not because others say so, but because she decided it was true. And that is the story I now live. Every single day, if this story touched you in any way, take a quiet moment and think of the woman in your life who once stitched the seams back together while no one noticed. You can share this story with her, or maybe just tell her you see her now. And if you are that woman, then I hope you know your quiet strength changes everything.